The scale of this disaster is almost impossible to comprehend. We are talking about an estimated 90,000 people affected across the region. 90,000! And the timing? It literally couldn't have been worse. The flood hit just before 9 a.m., right as kids in these villages were walking to school. Entire market areas and settlements were wiped out in mere minutes. And what makes this even more heartbreaking is the cruel irony for some of these communities. There was one settlement of 250 households that had actually been resettled here to rebuild their lives after the catastrophic 2015 earthquake. Just as they had finally gotten a sense of normalcy back, everything was snatched away again in a single instant.
At 8:37 a.m., a massive seismic event happens high up in the mountains. Barely 20 minutes later, by 9 a.m., the floodwaters surged from the Tibetan Plateau down the Lending Kola River, crashing into the Trishuli River system in Nepal, and completely obliterating the Rasuagati border crossing. Now, you might be wondering, how does water move that incredibly fast? Well, you have to picture the geographic gradient. The Tibetan Plateau is unbelievably high, and it drops sharply down into these steep, narrow Nepalese valleys. It essentially acts like a giant vertical water chute. The gravity assist was so immense and the velocity so intense that by the very next day, victims and debris were discovered hundreds of miles downstream in rivers flowing all the way into the northern Indian state of Uttar Pradesh. Initially, the U.S. Geological Survey logged a magnitude 4.4 tectonic earthquake. And honestly, that made total sense. This is a highly seismic region. Earthquakes happen all the time. But as experts from the USGS and the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development dug into the satellite and seismic data, they uncovered a completely different reality. The seismic signal wasn't a tectonic plate shifting deep underground. Actually, scratch that, it was a magnitude 5.2 physical collapse right on the surface. A colossal chunk of glacial ice and underlying bedrock just gave way high up in the Himalayas. It looked as if someone had taken a massive knife and sliced cleanly through the mountain. The sheer mass of millions of tons of rock and ice slamming into the earth shook the crust so violently that the early sensors misinterpreted the impact as a traditional tectonic shift.
This wasn't just a landslide, folks. It was a textbook cascading hazard. Basically, one event triggering a much deadlier chain reaction. Step 1, millions of tons of ice and rock avalanche right into the Lending Kola River. Step 2, that immense pile of debris completely blocks the river channel. Step 3 is where the real danger starts. The river backs up, forming this temporary, highly unstable lake behind the impromptu dam. And remember, this dam isn't made of reinforced concrete. It's just loose rock, mud, and friction holding back millions of gallons of water. Then comes step 4, the inevitable catastrophic failure. The hydrostatic pressure builds and builds against that loose debris until it catastrophically bursts, sending a violent, explosive tsunami of mud, water, and pulverized rock thundering right down the valley.
579. This represents the confirmed death toll in Nepal just days into the disaster, alongside an additional 5 confirmed dead on the Chinese side in Tibet's Gurong County. It is just a grim, somber reality to face. But tragically, the actual toll is likely far, far higher. 1,924 people were officially listed as missing in Nepal alone at the peak of the chaos, along with 558 individuals missing in Tibet. While some of those missing reports initially just reflected down cell networks, a lot of them ultimately represent people swallowed by the surge. Finding them is an unimaginably difficult task, because the very topography of the region has been rewritten by millions of tons of hardened mud. It makes standard search and rescue operations practically impossible.
And the crucial takeaway here is that this is a truly global tragedy. The victims range from neighboring India to tourists from across the oceans, like the USA, Australia, the UK, Malaysia, and Canada. This specific border area is a really bustling hub for international trade, trekking, and most notably, it's a major route for pilgrims heading to the deeply holy Mount Kailash and Lake Mansarovar in Tibet. That convergence of trade and spiritual tourism basically placed people from all corners of the world directly in the path of the flood.
Behind every single one of those numbers is a heartbreaking human story. Take Keshav Prasad Baral, a 68-year-old survivor who described the mud rising higher and higher in his home until it literally tore his wife right from his grip. Or think about the families far away, like women in Northern Virginia desperately refreshing their phones, just begging for any news of their missing spouses who had traveled across the world on a spiritual pilgrimage. The emotional ripple effect of this disaster stretches across the entire globe.
The sheer kinetic force of the water didn't just take lives. It effectively erased the region's physical and economic foundation. The loss of infrastructure is staggering. An entire 42-kilometer stretch of road linking Nepal to the Rasuagati border was obliterated. That severed the principal overland economic artery between Nepal and China, immediately strangling billions of dollars in international trade. 32 bridges were wiped away. And terrifyingly, the water heavily damaged 14 hydropower projects, packing thick mud and debris into the facilities. And amidst all this tragedy, there are some absolutely incredible moments of heroism. 3,700 people were rescued in Nepal in the immediate aftermath. But think about the sheer logistical nightmare of that operation for a second. With 42 kilometers of roads entirely gone, the sky was literally the only way out. The Nepali army had to rely heavily on military and private helicopters, dropping down into these incredibly narrow, hazardous gorges to pluck stranded survivors out of mango trees and off remaining rooftops just to fly them to safety.
The response has been this massive, multifaceted mobilization. The Nepali army has been physically digging through mud to access those trapped hydropower workers. Over on the Chinese side, Premier Li Chang traveled straight to the disaster-stricken area in Tibet to oversee rescue operations, while organizations like CARE and the Red Cross rushed in to distribute emergency kits, tarps, and water purification supplies. Interestingly, while the U.S. provided $500,000 in immediate aid and offers for search and rescue teams poured in globally, Nepal actually declined foreign rescue deployments initially. And, it makes total sense when you understand the landscape. In these tight, treacherous valleys, where roads are completely wiped out, funneling in hundreds of foreign personnel just creates a massive logistical bottleneck. So Nepal chose to rely on their own highly experienced, high-altitude military forces, the folks who know this treacherous terrain better than anyone else in the world.
As we look toward the relief and recovery phase, it's vital to understand that the danger in these Himalayan valleys is far from over. In fact, panic briefly halted all rescue operations in both Nepal and China just days after the initial flood. Why? Well, satellite imagery revealed new, highly unstable secondary barrier lakes forming upstream. A barrier lake is essentially a ticking time bomb. It's millions of gallons of glacial meltwater held back only by a fragile, natural dam of loose mud and landslide debris. Because these lakes were expanding with no visible outlet, they threatened a devastating second wave of flooding. Experts have warned that over 100 glacial lakes scattered throughout this specific area could pose similar, ongoing threats for a while. Assuming the immediate surge subsides without any secondary dam bursts, the long-term challenges are just immense. As Mona Sherpa from Care Nepal points out, families are left with absolutely nothing. No homes, no possessions, no livelihoods. The focus has to shift drastically to transitional housing for tens of thousands of displaced people. And perhaps most critically, preventing what's often called the second disaster, waterborne illness. When sanitation infrastructure is completely wiped out by flooding, the threat of deadly outbreaks like cholera and dysentery skyrockets. Rebuilding the destroyed trade routes and basic hygiene infrastructure is an urgent race against time.
And that brings us to the bigger picture. Scientists at the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development note that these cascading glacial hazards are increasing at a totally unprecedented pace. So I'll leave you with this final thought to consider. With cascading glacial hazards ramping up so quickly, is this disaster a grim warning of what is to come in the warming Himalayas?